Today we're talking about atheistic existentialists. We've considered some Christian existentialists, like Soren Kierkegaard and Zoe in Franny and Zoe. But today we're going to be looking at the two great French existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, both of whom were inspired by the Second World War and fought in the Second World War, or at least participated in the resistance. Jean-Paul Sartre was part of the actual resistance, and Albert Camus was editor of the resistance newspaper Combat. The two works that we're reading, The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger, were both written in various different hotel lobbies and cafes as Camus traveled around in the early 40s working and distributing the resistance newspaper Combat. Both Sartre and Camus were trying to understand what had happened to Western civilization, how the most scientific and Christian nations in the world were also the ones that allowed such atrocities, how it was that when they were tested morally, when the Nazis came to their doors, they collaborated or turned in their neighbors. Camus has three different stages in his work. The first stage is The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, which we're reading. And that's where he articulates the existentialist view of happiness and the meaning of life that he shared with Jean-Paul Sartre, and that they had both taken from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. In the second stage of his work, he deals with the problem of morality, how it is if you're supposed to get all your value from the inside, how can you have any obligations to anyone else? So in the plague, people are trapped in quarantine, as we are now, and have to decide if they don't believe in God, what reason they have to work together rather than to be out for themselves. Sartre and Camus, after the war, had a very famous falling out. And the last stage of Camus' work is in some way an attempt on Camus' part to respond to some of the criticisms to which Jean-Paul Sartre had exposed his work. We'll talk a little bit about the solution that Camus proposes in The Fall next time. So The Stranger deals with the question of whether killing is a logical consequences of the absurd. Dostoevsky had asked, if there is no God, is all permitted? Is nothing forbidden? Is it okay to kill? And just as Dostoevsky answered that question no and rejected nihilism or nothingism, so Camus in The Stranger, even though Meursault is a murderer, will ultimately reject the morality of murdering. The Myth of Sisyphus is going to ask the question whether suicide is a logical consequence of the absurd. And again, Camus is going to be influenced by Dostoevsky, and whose novel, The Possessed, has his character Kirillov commit suicide as the only free act a person can perform in rebellion against the absurd nature of the reality that we're thrown into. So, Camus was using the term the absurd to talk about what the human condition is if you believe that you're trapped within the standpoint of human existence and you're not going to make a leap of faith to believe in some meaning or God outside of your existence. This will be similar to what Heidegger had called anxiety, what Sartre is going to call bad faith or alienation. This is Camus' attempt to characterize what the existential condition is. And Camus said that the absurd is a conflict between our ideals and reality. It's not that the world is absurd. The absurd is essentially this contradiction, that we want certain things, we care about certain things, and the world doesn't give them to us. He says the absurd is the confrontation of the irrational and wild longing for clarity and happiness in the human heart, and then the fact that the world doesn't answer that call. So you can desire certain things in your life and find that reality doesn't live up to those ideals. We'll see later that he's going to criticize both physical suicide or killing yourself, and what he calls philosophical suicide, making a leap of faith like Kierkegaard does, to believe in God or believe in a source of values outside this world. We'll come to understand those two alternatives and Camus' argument against them better in just a second. So the myth of Sisyphus is Camus' famous story. And in the next slide, you can listen to his words along with an animation. The idea was that Sisyphus had loved life so much that he tried to trick the gods and refused to come back down to the life of the land of the living after they let him go back up. So he's dragged back down to the underworld, kicking and screaming, and then condemned as punishment to endlessly roll a ball up to the top of the hill. And that meaningless action to which Sisyphus is condemned is supposed to be a symbol of this dichotomy between ideals and reality. Our ideal is we push the rock up. The reality is it always rolls back down to the bottom of the hill. And we'll see how that applies to our lives if it's not already obvious. Get up, go to work, watch some TV, go to sleep, get up, go to work, watch some TV until we die. That would be the obvious way in which the myth of Sisyphus is supposed to be an allegory for our modern lives. And instead of saying that we should be unhappy about that, or that the logical consequence of recognizing that that's our condition is suicide, he's going to say that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, and we're going to be trying to figure out why Sisyphus is happy. Jean-Paul Sartre, the contemporary of Camus, had spelled out a little bit more clearly some of the basic assumptions of existentialism. Existentialism is different from all the theories we've considered so far, whether they thought it was your brain or your body or some social construction or your soul. Existentialism says all of those are wrong. If you're trapped within human existence and you're free, then nothing outside of you can determine you. So existentialism says there's no human nature. In fact, the very fact of being a human being means that you exist as a type of alienated consciousness. If we take our mind's eye model that we've been using, what you are as a self is alienated from the external objects outside of you. They exist as a nothingness to you. If we can't determine whether God exists as a nothingness or an indeterminacy outside of us. And if it's true that we can't even perceive our internal thoughts, then our soul is sort of a nothingness as well. So our existence is like a nothing sandwich. It exists as ideas and experiences trapped between the indeterminacy and nothingness of our death and the world before we were born, and the nothingness of our own mind and our own freedom. We'll see that he's going to describe the alienation of human consciousness. Alienation means separateness or being cut off within our own existence. The novel, The Stranger, that we're reading, the title of it is sometimes translated as the alien, the estranged, the cut off. Sartre describes it with the quote that human consciousness is not what it is, and it is what it's not. Right? We'll decipher that contradiction in just a little bit, but that's an important summary of Kant's view of consciousness that you'll want to remember and try to make sense of it as we explain it. So Sartre's definition of existentialism was to say that existence precedes essence, which we'll see is going to mean that we don't have a predetermined human nature, that we're radically free, and that we create our own human nature through free choices, and we create our values through these choices. Sometimes Sartre is quoted as saying, "You are your actions. To be is to do or to act." So to understand existence precedes essence, we probably need to understand the opposite, which are all the views that we've looked at so far, including Plato and Aristotle and Christianity, and even scientific views of the body. They all think that essence precedes existence. And Sartre uses a metaphor, an analogy to explain that. An artisan or a worksman who's creating a tool He uses the example of scissors or a paper cutter. So the artisan has an idea of the scissors, a blueprint in his mind. And that blueprint actually precedes the act of making. And then he brings its actual existence into being by basing it on the blueprint or the plan that he has in his mind. So literally in time, the essence or the plan of the thing precedes the thing's existence, and it's brought into existence in accordance with that essence or plan. So that means really external determination, that what a thing is, its nature, and what it's good for, its values, are determined from the outside. This is obviously true in the case of God. If God created you, he had an idea of what you were going to be. We were made in God's image. And therefore, what we are is human nature, and what the purpose or meaning of our life is determined from the outside by the origin of our nature, by God. It's equally true of science. Even though we don't believe there's a God or a maker, we believe that biology, our genes, and the material universe preceded us, and we had evolved and been determined by our bodies and by external circumstances in a way that determines our nature and determines what conditions will make us flourish as a human organism. So, Sartre had thought that meant that what you were and how you existed was determined from the outside according to essence precedes existence, according to this older view. This was the view that there was something which was the meaning of your life. Those cartoons you see where the guy searches and searches and climbs up to the top of the mountain and finds a wise man who can tell him what the meaning of his life is. That's based upon the idea that essence precedes existence. Existence precedes essence precisely means that there is nothing which is the meaning of your life. There's nothing you can do, there's nothing you can accomplish that will give meaning to your life. There's nothing you can do and nothing you can accomplish that will make you happy. Just as we had seen that if love isn't properties and isn't feelings, then there's nothing that you can do to make another person love you. Existence precedes essence means there's nothing you can do that is the external meaning or happiness of your life. So existence precedes essence means that you're thrown into existence. You were born, they slapped you on the rear end, and you didn't come with an instruction manual, and you existed as a little indeterminacy or a blank slate. And then it's only your experiences, your acts, your choices that allow you to create yourself. So literally, you're thrown into existence without a nature as a blank slate, and then only through your choices and actions do you create your own essence. And for Sartre, this means that we're radically free in a way that we normally try to deny and try to avoid seeing. He calls this tendency to lie to ourselves and to deceive ourselves about our freedom and hide it from ourselves. He calls it bad faith. Bad faith is literally like a lying promise or a type of deception. In this case, it's a type of self-deception. We'll see that Sartre thought that this freedom that we're condemned to, being thrown into existence as a nothingness or indeterminacy, was like a terrible fate, because at every moment we were condemned to be responsible for ourselves, and at every moment condemned to fill up this moment of our existence and to create ourselves. So if you wanted to, at this moment, you could stop listening to this lecture, throw down your chair on the floor, yell to your family, walk out the door, get in your car, and drive west, and never see your family, and never finish college, and never do anything again. You may say to yourself, well, I can't do that. I've got exams, and I've got grades, and I have to do this, and I've got a boyfriend, or I've got a girlfriend. But those things, those external things, are not really stopping you from doing that. What's stopping you from doing that is you're choosing not to. You don't want to because of those things. So Sartre thinks that we're always radically free, since what we are is essentially this nothingness that comes into existence. He thinks that we're radically free to recreate ourselves, to create our nature and our values, what we are and what we're good for, or what our purpose is. We're free to create it in any way that we like from the inside, rather than having it determined from the outside. You can watch this little slide that will tell you, give you an account of Sartre's account of existence precedes essence. So we're going to see now the connection between the myth of Sisyphus, rolling the ball up to the top of the hill, and then seeing it roll back down again, and the relationship between existence precedes essence. So for existence precedes essence, we're thrown into existence as a nothingness, or an indeterminacy. Every morning when you open your eyes, your day is a blank slate laid out before you, and you have to say, so what am I going to do today? And Sartre's point is that nothing that you did yesterday, nothing that happened to you before, is ever determining that choice, or ever filling in those blanks for you. You may think, I've got all these things on my schedule, but if you wanted to, you could get up and take off and never come back. Sartre thought that you were even responsible for like the coronavirus, or you were responsible for the war in Iraq or the war in Syria. And you may say, how can I be responsible for those things? I didn't have anything to do with their origination. But Sartre says that doesn't matter. When you wake up today, you make a choice whether the coronavirus is going to be the first thing on your mind or whether you're going to ignore it. Whether you're going to spend your life fascinated and obsessed with the war in Syria and getting justice and helping those people, or whether you're going to act as if it doesn't exist. Since your entire existence is just your experience, how it exists for you is up to your choice. So at every moment, you're this nothingness or indeterminacy. And of course, if you've ever tried to play the game of think of nothing, or become so bored that your mind just sort of goes fuzzy and clears out all completely, that's sort of like not existing. You can't not think. This is what's meant by saying that human consciousness is what it's not. Because human consciousness is essentially this freedom or indeterminacy, but it can't exist as a blank slate. It can't exist as indeterminacy. You are condemned to choose. You can't help but choose. So when I say you have to choose for yourself what you're going to do today, you could say, I'm not going to choose. I'm just going to pull the covers up over my head and not do anything. But Sartre would say that you've still chosen. You've chosen not to choose, or you've chosen to stay in bed. At every moment, you will choose. You may choose not to do anything and just to act on the momentum of the past, but you've still chosen to do that. You can't escape that freedom. So at every moment, you throw yourself into existence and become some determinate reality. A second ago, what you were going to do in this moment was indeterminate and full of possibilities, but now you sat here listening to me blather on for another minute, and it's over. And that is just a determinate existence. It now exists. You may have ideals about what you were going to do today, and you may sit on the couch and find that your reality, when it comes into existence, doesn't live up to those ideals. So you play roles and act in certain ways and make decisions. And Sartre says that just like Sisyphus, the ball always rolling back down to the bottom of the hill, so every time you try to make yourself into something, you find that you're not that thing. You're more than just the choice you made today. You're more than just the choice you made a second ago. So literally, there's nothing that you can do to make you happy. That doesn't mean that you can never, when we say reality never lives up to ideals, we're not saying you can't win the Super Bowl or become a ballerina or become president. We're just saying that should you do that, the very moment that you achieve that, the ball will roll back down to the bottom of the hill, and you're going to have to ask yourself the next day, so what am I going to do today? How am I going to fill up these 12 hours? And Sartre's going to say that you can't fill it up by saying, well, yesterday I was the president, or back in high school I was the prom king, or I was a big man on campus because I played football. You're no longer that person. If you attempt to live through those glory days or live through that past, you'll find yourself being fake. Just in the same way, you can look at yourself the way you act with your friends or with your teachers or with your parents, and you can say, I'm not that person. Sartre and Camus like to talk about the absurdity or the weirdness of like staring at your hand until it looks weird, or maybe you've done the thing where you repeat a word over and over and over again until it sounds like nonsense, or you can stare at your face in the mirror. You can see that thing, determine it in front of you, those words, that hand, that face, and you can say that I'm not that thing. I'm more than that. I'm not that thing that I've made myself. In the same way that you can wake up and see the choices that you've made, like in the Talking Heads song, and say, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful car. This is not my beautiful life. Because at every moment, those choices and accomplishments you've made in the past roll back down to the bottom of the hill and become nothingness again. So this is, in some ways, the very nature of time. Sartre's great book was called Being and Nothingness. But Heidegger's great work was called Being and Time. They both are referring to this same cycle. In some sense, you live in a nothing sandwich. Your existence all happens in this little razor's edge between the nothingness of the past, which no longer is, and the nothingness of the future, which is not yet. And at every moment, you are condemned to make a choice. If you just sit there and do nothing, you've made a choice to just be the same thing you were a second ago. And the very moment that you make that choice, it vanishes into nothingness and becomes the indeterminacy of the next moment, which you then have to fill, and you then have to choose again. So nothing can ever make you happy because of the very structure of time. At the moment which it makes you happy, it's already vanishing away into nothingness. Maybe you've had this feeling when you're out with your friends or having a good time, or that the last summer before college started, and you sort of felt how fragile and vanishing the good times that you were having at the moment that you have them. Sometimes people like to take pictures of them and try to capture those moments and post them on Facebook as if they could somehow stop those moments from vanishing. So the desperateness with which we sometimes cling to our happy moments and wish they would last is an example of how nothing can ever make us happy. If we try to identify with our past accomplishments, we'll end up being fake or phony, and all of our present accomplishments will vanish into the nothingness of the past. So human consciousness is what it's not, in that it's a freedom which has to define itself and make itself into some determinate experience. And it's also not what it is, because every time it makes itself into something determinate, every time it finishes a decision, that decision or accomplishment vanishes into the nothingness of the past, and you're faced with that nothingness or indeterminacy or choice again. We're going to see that this is similar to the ideals and reality. Ideals are you want something to happen, you care about something, and therefore you act or choose to bring it into existence. But then the reality always vanishes into the nothingness of the past, or the reality never lives up to those ideals. And we'll see that the two bad choices of philosophical suicide and physical suicide correspond to one or the other of those emotions. So remember, Camus trying to argue that suicide is not the logical consequence of the absurd, just as he's trying to argue in The Stranger that even if there is no God and if nothing matters, you still can't kill someone. Not everything is permitted. So physical suicide is killing your reality. In physical suicide, if your ideals and your reality don't match up, one way of handling that is to check out of reality. You can't handle the illness that you're condemned to, and therefore you decide to end your life. Camus is going to think that the absurd doesn't justify that. And he also thinks that very few of us actually commit physical suicide in the final way of actually ending our life. Most of us, he says, commit suicide on the installment plan. That is, we kill ourselves a little bit at a time. He'll say of the priest at the end that he was no longer really even alive. So if you check out of reality by sticking your head in the TV set, or playing a video game, or drinking a beer, or taking some drugs, or denying your reality and detaching yourself from it, you're committing a type of physical suicide. You're sort of killing your soul until you're no longer even really living in the world at all. That would be physical suicide. That's refusing to recognize your reality. So if we go back here, physical suicide would be this motion. At every moment where you become a determinate reality, you negate that motion and the ball rolls back down the bottom of the hill. Philosophical suicide is killing your ideals. It's stopping caring about things. One way of reacting to the inevitable failures that we encounter is to sort of become hardened, to no longer care about things. So you may have had an ideal for what your relationship was going to be when you were young. And then after you find bad relationship after bad relationship, you may settle and come to believe that there is no such thing as love and not care when each of your relationships fails to live up to your ideals and is somewhat less than perfect. Camus thought that philosophical suicide was also what believing in God was. He thought that that was really putting all of your baskets in the heaven, all your eggs rather, in the heaven basket, and no longer caring about this life. He's influenced by Dostoevsky's argument again, that by accepting his ticket to heaven, he would become incapable of caring about things in this life. So let's look at the argument that we're going to see in Sisyphus and why one must imagine Sisyphus happy and why suicide wouldn't be the logical consequence. Camus, like Dostoevsky, believes that it's really impossible not to care about things. In fact, the more you rebel against something, the more it shows that you care about it. So if you can't handle the ideals that your parents sort of foist upon you, and you rebel, and you pierce your nose, and you get a tattoo, and you cut all your hair off and dye it pink, your rebellion against the standards of your parents aren't really showing that you don't care about what your parents think. In fact, the more you rebel, the more you actually care about what your parents think. If you really didn't care what they think, you wouldn't respond to it at all. Eleanor Roosevelt had a famous saying that no one can make you feel inferior without your consent, which means that if you walk through the cafeteria and someone laughs and you feel embarrassed, or someone calls you a name and that bothers you, it's always because in some sense you care about what they think. If you didn't care at all what they thought, it wouldn't bother you, wouldn't even give it another thought, just like you don't care what some stranger in South America thinks of you. You don't react to it, you don't care about it at all. So think about this question once you recognize that. If nothing matters, if life is without meaning and nothing matters, then does it matter that nothing matters? So if nothing matters, does it matter that nothing matters? Camus says, obviously, if nothing really mattered, if you really didn't care about anything, would you be upset about the fact that you didn't care about anything? Like if you really didn't care about what your parents were saying to you, would you be upset and rebel against their expectations? So in the same way, if you really didn't care about anything, then you wouldn't be upset about the absurdity of the universe. You wouldn't be upset about the fact that human beings die. You wouldn't be upset about the suffering of innocence. So the only reason you might have to want to kill yourself is because you love life so much that you can't bear what denies life. You can't bear what harms life. Just in the same way, you may remember Dostoevsky's argument that we can't torture an innocent child to save all of humanity. Again, the only reason you would want to save all of humanity is because you cared so much about the suffering of innocent children. So just as it's inconsistent to torture a kid because you love kids so much, so it's inconsistent to kill yourself because you love life so much. So Dostoevsky thinks you have to open yourself up to, or absurdly open yourself up or accept the absurd. And then once you do that, then you'll be able to throw yourself into the enjoyment of life from the inside rather than always attempting to get external things that you can never reach. So Camus rather thought that once you accepted the absurd, you would have this revolt against external things. You would have freedom from trying to live up to external standards. You would no longer be defined by what your parents thought or defined by the absurdity of the world. You would no longer be defined by the fact that the rock was rolling back down to the bottom of the hill. And therefore, the most important consequence was a type of passion. You would be able to live your moment fully and completely from the inside, in virtue of being able to sort of suck the gusto out of every little moment of experience and get all of the value of that instant. So Sisyphus must be happy because even though he's sad at first when he recognizes he's never going to get the rock up to the top of the hill, that robs him of any belief or dependence on external values. And then once he discovers that it's the momentary struggle towards the heights, the enjoyment of each instant of experience that gives him meaning, then that can't be taken away. Again, this is based upon Dostoevsky, who you may recall had something like this actually happen to him. He was condemned to death because one of the publications he was associated with said things critical of the Tsar. So he was made to believe that he was going to be executed. He had the blindfold and the last cigarette, and he heard people being executed in front of him. And at the very last moment, he was given a reprieve and was sent to Siberia instead. At that moment, he had this revelation that once he really thought he was going to die, all of his accumulations, all of his friends, all of those things disappeared. Just like when we asked you, what would you do if you knew that you were going to die on Friday? So at that moment, once he saw that he could still enjoy the instant, he could still enjoy the feeling of his body and the sun on his face and breathing in and breathing out, he saw that that value couldn't be taken away from him. So that recognition made him happy in the same way that Sisyphus's recognition made him happy. So an essential feature of existentialist literature is this confrontation with death that somehow transforms you and allows you to see that the real meaning of your life comes from the inside, from the struggle itself to reach the heights. So Meursault in The Stranger is going to have that same confrontation with death, both his own death and the question of murder. Meursault's name expresses one of the ways in which Camus saw the absurd. Literally, his name, Meursault, is a combination of the French words for mer is sea and sun is soleil. One way of seeing the absurd is this little sliver of life between the nothingness and the barrenness of the salty ocean and the barrenness of the desert. And the question was to be able to enjoy this little sliver of existence and happiness that we get in between the nothingness of death, without allowing it to make us stop caring about things. You had to open yourself up to that contradiction of both caring and not caring. So The Stranger is in some ways a very puzzling book. Here are some things that Camus said in his preface to the American edition of The Stranger that caused the book to be somewhat controversial. He said that Meursault was a hero because he's condemned to death because he doesn't play the game. He refuses to lie, he says. He thinks that most people are engaged in that bad faith, in that lying to yourself, and that denial of human freedom. And furthermore, perhaps even more controversially, he would say that Meursault is the only Christ our generation deserves. And of course, that's controversial because Meursault is going to turn out to be a murderer. Even if you haven't read The Stranger, you know the story of The Stranger. It may be the most influential novel of the 20th century because it spawned an entire series of teenage rebellion and alienation films. So James Dean, the rebel without a cause, is someone who's rebelled against external values, but yet hasn't made that choice to choose his own values. You may know the film Casablanca, which was made just shortly after the publication of The Myth of Sisyphus. Camus looked up to Humphrey Bogart and sometimes dressed and affected the mannerisms of the main character of Casablanca. In Casablanca, you have a man who is separated from the woman that he loves during the German occupation of France, is so disheartened and upset by that failure of reality to live up to his ideals, that he strikes out for himself and starts a casino in Casablanca in northern Africa, and thinks that he can live out his life in happiness without caring about or doing anything about the war which is waging in Europe. Eventually, the woman comes back into his life, and he has to choose whether he's going to not care about the Nazis or whether he's going to help her and do something. And the same thing is true of all of the teenage heroes of the 50s that are caricaturized in Fonzie of Happy Days, the tough, cool, detached guy. There were two films that were popular together when my children were young. Maybe you've seen them as well. One was 10 Things I Hate About You, and the other one was She's All That. They were both based upon the story of the Taming of a Shrew from Shakespeare, where a popular, cool guy takes on as a bet that he'll make this unpopular, uncool girl fall in love with him and go to the prom with him or become his girlfriend. And at first he thinks that because nothing matters, he doesn't care. He thinks that he can do this and hurt this woman's feelings and use her to achieve winning this bet. And he thinks that that won't matter because nothing matters. But we all know how the story ends. The cool and indifferent hero eventually discovers that they really do care, that they really do love the person, and they can't go through with hurting them. So we may want to think a little bit. You can think about this on your own and maybe ask some questions about it on VoiceThread. But ask yourself, what are we supposed to think about Meursault? He's strangely indifferent. Many of the heroes in these versions have been sort of Disneyfied to make them more attractive. But in some ways, Meursault isn't very attractive at all. He's really indifferent and sort of lackadaisical. He may remind you of the character of a movie like Napoleon Dynamite, who's completely disaffected and so indifferent to everything that it seems like he doesn't care about or isn't enthusiastic about anything. He, because of that, he's much more honest than most of us would be. So he can smoke or drink at his mother's funeral, and he's in some way upset about the fact of his mother's funeral, doesn't want to march in the procession and finds it's too hot. Most of us would feel that way, but most of us would be too honest to admit it. He's just as happy to make friends with Salamano, the weird little guy, loser guy with his mangy dog, as he is with Raymond, who is sort of a pimp who's enlisting his help to beat and punish his girlfriend. Even when his boss yells at him for having to take off time for his mother's funeral, which seems to be an awful thing to do, he sort of says, "Oh, I can sort of understand his point of view." So you may want to ask yourself, what's good about Meursault? In particular, why does Marie like him so much? This is the puzzle about these films as well. Why does the girl like the indifferent, cool hero who wears the leather jacket and drives off on his motorcycle alone instead of liking the nice, polite guy with the varsity jacket who cares about all the things that the crowd cares about and that she's so anxious about? Just as in romantic novels, part of this is the transformation and thrill of having someone take her outside of her comfort zone. But remember, the existentialist thinks that she's been lying to herself. She's cut off her ability to care about things. She's committed philosophical or physical suicide and killed her soul. And even though the existentialist hero, or Meursault, doesn't care about anything, he's still capable of caring about the moment. So despite the fact that he seems kind of detached and indifferent, the scenes of them swimming together and passing foam back and forth from their mouth, between their mouths as they kiss in the sea, gives the idea of why Marie would have liked Meursault. Maybe the strangest passage in the beginning of the book is when, after they've just gone to a movie and slept with each other, after his mother's funeral, a fact that will be brought up later at his trial, she asks him, do you love me? And while most of us, under those conditions, would have had the decency to lie, Meursault says, I don't think that question has any meaning, but if you really want to know, I guess probably not. And Camus, in his journals, when he was talking about this scene, had said that no woman, in the moment of passion, when a man is holding her or kissing her, wonders about his feelings or wonders whether he loves her. When she asks, do you love me? What she's really asking is, will you still love me tomorrow? You may remember this, the first time that you liked somebody and somebody liked you back. You weren't happy just resting in that moment. You always had to go further and say, okay, are we boyfriend and girlfriend now? Or are we going steady? Will you wear my ring or wear my jacket, or whatever the kids are doing these days, as a token of commitment? And Meursault, of course, is thinking that is sort of the death of love. That's why he thinks the question of love that she's asking about is meaningless, because that would be negating your freedom and trying to get the ball up to the top of the hill and just let it rest there. It's exhausting to always be wondering, does she like me? Does she like me? Or does he like me? Does he like her? We want to get the ball up to the top of the hill to say we're committed and say we're going steady, and then we don't have to worry about it anymore. But Camus, the existentialist, is going to say you can't do that. At every moment, the ball always rolls back down to the bottom of the hill, and you're condemned to choose your relationship again at every particular moment. So the crucial part of the first part of the novel, with which the part one ends, which was your reading assignment for today, is the confrontation that Meursault has with the Arab. Meursault had thought that he could just go along living his life, being happy and enjoying the moment. He thought that he could ignore the fact that a war was waging, or ignore the fact of his social and cultural situation. Camus had said that the primary question of our time, of the 20th century, was, do you want to be a murderer, or do you want to be a victim of murder? Do you want to be tortured, or do you want to be a victim of torture? Again, we may be deceiving ourselves. You haven't been faced yet with the consequences of whether you want to fight in a war or whether you want to be the victim in a war. You've had the privilege of sort of not having to face that. But Meursault is deceiving himself if he thinks he doesn't have to deal with those facts and that he doesn't really care about them. And this all comes to a head when he's confronted with the social injustice of his culture at the time when he kills the Arab. So remember, this is the Arabs are the family of the young woman who was treated so badly by Raymond, and he and Raymond are staying at Celeste's house. They go out for a walk and have a little confrontation with the Arab young men, and then they go back, and Meursault, for some reason, decides to go out again and decides to take Raymond's pistol with him. And then he encounters one of the Arabs there. And the puzzle is always, of course, why did he shoot him? He was just doing it in self-defense. Sometimes when I ask students what they make of the stranger, some of them will say, I think Meursault should have moved to a cooler climate. Because the way that he described it almost makes him seem as if the sun made him do it, or the heat somehow compelled him to. Remember, Sartre would say, that's lying to yourself, that's bad faith. You were really free, you really chose to do that. And it wasn't the sun that made you do that at all. So, remember, he sees the Arab, and he talks about the heat scorching his cheek and beads of sweat were gathering in my eyebrows. Just the same sort of heat as at my mother's funeral. You may want to think about why it's the same sort of heat. And then I couldn't stand it any longer, and I took a step forward. He acts as if the heat made him take a step forward, when really he had chosen to. Why is he lying about it? He said, I knew it was a fool thing to do. I wouldn't get out of the sun by moving a yard. But I took that step, just one step forward, and the Arab drew his knife and held it up toward me athwart the sunlight. Now you may want to note the sort of the apocalyptic biblical language that goes on here. A shaft of light shot upward from the steel, and I felt as if a long, thin blade transfixed my forehead. At the same moment, all the sweat that had accumulated in my eyebrows splashed down into my eyelids, covering them with a warm film of moisture. Beneath the veil of brine and tears, my eyes were blinded. I was conscious only of the symbols of the sun clashing on my skull, and less distinctly of the keen blade of light flashing up from the knife, scarring my eyelashes, gouging into my eyeballs. And then everything began to reel before my eyes. A fiery gust came from the sea, and the sky cracked in two from end to end, and a great sheet of flame poured down the rift. Every nerve in my body was a steel spring, and my grip closed on the revolver. The trigger gave, and the smooth underbelly of the butt jogged my palm. And so with that crisp whip-crack sound, it all began. I shook off my sweat in the clean veil of light. I knew I'd shattered the balance of the day, the spacious calm of this beach on which I'd been happy. So that first act is very strange. You can see he's lying to himself. Again, he doesn't even say he pulled the trigger. He just says, my grip closed on the revolver and the trigger gave. And then with that whip-crack sound, it all began. All of a sudden he realizes that he can't just go on living as he did. All of a sudden he's been faced with murder. That first act is in some ways understandable. It's like an absurd act. If nothing matters, then every act is equally absurd. Swimming with Marie is absurd. Marching in my mother's funeral is absurd. Pulling the trigger is absurd. They're all equally meaningless. And that type of absurd action sometimes makes sense. We sometimes have an impulse to perform absurd actions. Like, do you ever have the desire to yell something inappropriate, say at church or in some formal gathering? Or psychologists say that when you're standing on a tall building and you're afraid of heights, it's not that you're afraid of falling, you're actually afraid of jumping. You can feel a little impulse within you desiring to jump, because you can see it's sort of like the choosing an act for no good as a pure expression of your will. You want to show that your freedom can do even this. If you wanted to, you could jump off this building. If you wanted to, you could yell out some obscene word. Even though it would change everything and destroy your life, you have the power within your little mind to perform that great act. And we feel that desire. Edgar Allan Poe called it the imp of the perverse, this desire to perform these absurd and meaningless actions. But that's not what the puzzle is in this last part. The really significant part is what goes on afterwards. So after he's realized that he shattered the spacious calm of this beach on which I'd been happy, he fired 4 shots more into the inert body on which they left no visible trace. And each successive shot was another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. So he's already shot the body. It's dead. He looks down on it and he shoots it again. Boom. And there's another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. And then boom again. Another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. And then boom, boom. 2 more fateful raps on the door of my undoing. Why in the world those 4 extra shots? That seems to be a real puzzle. And part of it may involve something that you may not be aware of. Meursault, like Camus, is a white colonial Frenchman who at that time were occupying Algeria. And he just shot an Arab. This would be similar to a white man in Alabama in 1939 shooting a black man, an African-American man who'd had a knife. When the police show up, if he's got a knife in his hand and you've put a hole in his body and killed him, the police are going to assume self-defense. They're going to let you off. And that's what would have happened to Meursault had he not shot the 4 extra times. So it's as if Meursault chooses for the very first time. Up to now, he's been like the rebel without a cause. Nothing has mattered. For the very first time, he's decided to fill that vacuum of values with some choice that something is going to matter to him. He's going to take a stand. And even if it doesn't matter to his culture and his society that an Arab has been killed for no reason, he's going to choose to take responsibility for it. He's going to choose that it matters to him. Of course, a little bit too late since he's already shot them. But for the first time, Meursault makes a step towards choosing his own values. It may make it easier to understand it to compare it to another classic teenage rebellion movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You may remember when they stole Cameron's father's car, and were trying to run the car backwards to reduce the mileages so he wouldn't tell. It doesn't work, and all of a sudden Cameron recognizes that he wants to be caught. He wants to confront his father. He wants to take responsibility for his actions. In the next slide, you can listen to the video of it, but he's going to say, I'm not going to stand by and allow the events that determine my life to be chosen for me without my input. I'm going to take a stand. So in some sense, this absurd act of Meursault at the end of part 1 is him taking a stand, choosing to be judged, choosing to take responsibility. And we're going to have to see when we get to the very end of the novel, it won't be until the very end that Meursault actually becomes the existentialist hero, where he starts to choose his own values from the inside. So you should pay attention, special attention, to the last 5 or 6 pages, and especially the last page or so, where Meursault has the epiphany, the existentialist epiphany, when faced with death. All right, we'll talk about that next time.